Under a pewter Boston sky, a letter arrives like a summons from fate. A reclusive tycoon, scarred by fire and rumor, asks for a wife by trial, not by promise, to stand beside him through the summer's cruel gaze, to endure whispers that cut deeper than knives. Rachel, 33 and tired of vanishing, answers yes. Behind polished doors and velvet masks, a portrait hides a wound, a ledger hides a crime, and a secret is poised to shatter the season. Duty or desire, pride or truth. One choice will unmask them all. Before we begin, tell me where you're listening from, and what do you most love about historical romances? The longing, the scandal, or the triumph after the storm? Boston, spring of 1890. The sky above Beacon Hill was a pale, pewter grey, and the air carried that faint chill of the Atlantic that clung even to the promise of warmer days. In a quiet boarding house overlooking Charles Street, the sound of the city's restless heart, carriages, bells, voices, filtered through lace curtains yellowed by time. Inside, Rachel Alder sat by a narrow window, her sewing forgotten in her lap. The letter lay open upon the table beside her, its seal broken, its contents trembling in her hand like a confession whispered too late. The handwriting was elegant but deliberate, as though each word had been carved with restraint rather than written in haste. Elias Harrow. The name itself carried a weight she could almost hear, as if forged from iron and sea wind. A man she had never met, and yet one who spoke of marriage as one might speak of a business alliance, clearly, without adornment, without promises of affection. "I ask only for honesty and endurance," the letter said. "A companionship born not of appearances, but of resolve. If you wish to accept, you must come to Newport for the summer season and remain at my side despite what society may say of me. Only then will I consider the union complete." Rachel had read those words a dozen times since morning, as though the ink might rearrange itself into something softer, something more romantic. It never did. Still, her fingers lingered over the paper with an inexplicable tenderness. At 33, Rachel had known the quiet erosion of years spent in duty and loss. She had buried her father only months before, after long years of tending to his fragile heart and faded sermons. His faith had once filled every corner of their home. Now, even prayer seemed to echo against bare walls. Her world had grown small, too small for the ache that lived within her. There had been another letter once, written in a younger hand, filled with promises of devotion. That letter had been followed by an announcement in the Boston Evening Transcript, her suitor's engagement to a banker's daughter, accompanied by a photograph of the bride's diamonds. The humiliation had burned, but the silence afterward burned longer. Perhaps that was why she could not dismiss Elias Harrow's letter. Beneath its austerity was something honest, something raw. A man unafraid to show his scars, at least in words. Society whispered he was monstrous, that the fire which had consumed his warehouses had also disfigured him beyond recognition, but Rachel knew something of ruin and endurance. She knew that what the world deemed ugly was often merely misunderstood. The boarding mistress called her name from the corridor, but Rachel did not answer. Her gaze was fixed on the window, where the rain began to fall, soft as sighs. She thought of Newport, of mansions glittering by the sea, of women perfumed and perfidious, of men who wore charm like armor. She imagined herself among them, plain but composed, standing beside a man the world avoided. A shiver ran through her, not of fear, but of awakening. That evening, she packed her few belongings, her late mother's locket, a second-hand gown of deep amethyst satin, and her worn gloves. Her reflection in the mirror startled her. There was a calm in her eyes that had not been there in years, a quiet defiance that whispered, "You will not be invisible anymore." 3 days later, a carriage carried her south along the post road, through towns where spring's first blossoms clung to the hedgerows. Newport greeted her with a sky the colour of pewter and the scent of salt. The Harrow estate rose at the edge of the cliffs, A vast house of dark stone and glimmering windows, its turrets shrouded in mist. The Atlantic crashed far below, relentless and eternal. The door was opened by Mrs. Quinn, a stout woman in black with eyes that seemed to see through silk and pretense alike. Her curtsy was respectful but measured, as if she had yet to decide whether this visitor was to be pitied or admired. "Mr. Harrow is in his study," she said, her voice even, her accent softened by decades in service. "He does not receive many guests. You are expected." Rachel followed her through corridors, lined with portraits of solemn-faced men and women. The air smelled faintly of cedar and candle smoke. She caught sight of a young girl, Lena, she would later learn, darting from one doorway to another, clutching a sketchbook, eyes wide and uncertain. At last the study doors opened. Elias Harrow stood by the window, tall and motionless, his profile cut against the grey sea beyond. He did not turn immediately, but when he did, Rachel's breath faltered. The rumours had not lied. A long scar curved from his left temple down to the corner of his mouth, its pale edge stark against his tanned skin. Yet the injury did not disfigure him as society claimed. It defined him, like a mark left by fate itself. His eyes, dark and unreadable, met hers without apology. "Miss Alder," he said, his voice low, controlled, edged with something that might have once been warmth. "You came." "I did," she replied, steady despite the tremor in her chest. "Your letter asked for honesty and endurance. I possess both." Something flickered in his gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or the faintest spark of admiration. "Then you already have more courage than most," he murmured. From the corner of her eye, Rachel saw Lawrence Harrow standing half in shadow by the door. He was handsome, in the polished way of men who know it. His smile was smooth, too smooth. "So this is the brave lady who accepted my cousin's invitation," he said lightly. "Newport has been waiting to meet you, Miss Alder. I fear it won't be kind." Rachel lifted her chin. "Then I shall return the courtesy." The faintest smile ghosted across Elias's scarred mouth. Mrs. Quinn, silent beside the mantel, folded her hands, her expression unreadable, but there was a spark of approval in her eyes. Outside, the sea roared, the wind rattling the windows as if to test the foundations of the house, and the resolve of those within it. Rachel did not flinch. She had come seeking a life that would make her visible again, even if it meant standing beside a man the world feared. And as she met Elias Harrow's gaze for the first time, she understood that what awaited her was not safety, but transformation. The first ember of something unnamed stirred in the silence between them, fragile, forbidden, but alive. The spring sun in Newport had a deceptive warmth, veiling the sharpness of society's bite beneath its golden glow. The gardens along Bellevue Avenue blossomed with the perfume of lilacs and roses, but Rachel Alder quickly discovered that among the city's glittering elite, sweetness bloomed only in appearance. Beneath the ribbons and lace, the polite curtsies and crystalline laughter, there lurked a hunger for spectacle, for scandal, for the humiliation of anyone who did not know the precise weight of her own name. Rachel stepped from the carriage outside the Whitcomb residence, a sprawling marble estate known for its manicured terraces and relentless gossip. The invitation had arrived that morning, sealed in pale blue wax and scented with something artificial and overwhelming. "A ladies' luncheon in honor of the season's brightest guests," it read. Yet Rachel knew she had not been invited as a guest of honor. She had been summoned to be observed, measured, and, if necessary, discarded. Inside, chandeliers shimmered above linen-draped tables where ladies in lavender and ivory sat in practiced poses. Their eyes turned as Rachel entered, not with welcome, but with calculation. Her dusty blue walking dress, though freshly pressed and perfectly modest, bore none of the embellishments of fashion-forward society. She wore her straw hat without ostrich plumes, her gloves mended at the thumb, and no escort but her own resolve. She curtsied to Mrs. Whitcomb, a woman with a face sculpted by decades of tight smiles and tighter opinions. "Miss Alder," the hostess said, drawing out the syllables like tasting a new wine. "You are braver than most." Rachel inclined her head. "Courage, I've found, is often born of necessity." The words earned her a flicker of something. Not quite approval, but perhaps surprise. At the far end of the table, Lady Grafton, a widow with a voice like brittle porcelain, leaned toward her companion. "That's her," she murmured behind her fan. "The one Harrow plucked from obscurity. Can you imagine? Brought in by letter like ordering china from a catalogue." Her companion giggled. "I hear he hides his face in candlelight, and that she's been forbidden from removing his gloves." Rachel's ears burned, but she did not let the colour rise to her cheeks. She reached for a cup of weak tea and smiled at the empty space before her, refusing to flinch. She had endured the dying days of her father's illness, watched creditors pick apart her family home, and stood alone at the back of a church while another woman married the man who once swore eternal devotion. The whispers of Newport matrons could not wound her more than life already had, but it was not their cruelty that left the deepest mark. It was Lawrence Harrow's smile. He arrived late, his entrance carefully timed. Clad in a tailored charcoal morning coat, his cravat pinned with a pearl stickpin, Lawrence moved through the crowd with the ease of a practiced charmer. He kissed hands, bowed with just enough humility, and offered Rachel a look that lingered a moment too long. "I see the lions have been fed," he said lightly as he took the seat beside her. "Did they bare their teeth or merely their pearls?" Rachel met his gaze, her grey-blue eyes steady. "Some did not bother to hide either." He laughed, a sound too smooth, too rehearsed. "Ah, but you give them something to talk about, Miss Alder. Elias never did understand the value of a good scandal." She turned toward him, lowering her voice. "And you? Do you?" Lawrence tilted his head, and in that moment the light struck his eyes with a cold gleam. "I understand value in all its forms." Later, as they filed into the parlour for music and petit four, Rachel caught sight of her reflection in a gilt mirror. She did not recognize the expression on her face, composed, yes, but shadowed. Her hands were folded, her chin lifted, but something within her felt brittle. The game had begun, and she had only just learned the rules. That evening, back at the estate, Mrs. Quinn met her at the entrance with a measured glance. "There's to be a ball at the Prescott Hall tomorrow," the housekeeper said, handing her a pale card. "Charity for the Sailors' Widow Fund. Mr. Harrow intends to attend." Rachel took the card without comment. The candlelight flickered across the hall's polished wood, casting long shadows. She looked up toward the staircase, where the air seemed to hold a silence that belonged only to Elias. The following night, Rachel stood before the cheval mirror in her guest room, smoothing the folds of her emerald gown. It had belonged to a friend of her mother's, a dressmaker who had once stitched for the wives of Boston merchants. The fabric had faded slightly, but Rachel had adjusted the seams, added lace to the neckline, and taken care to polish the tiny seed pearls that adorned the sleeves. It was the most beautiful garment she owned, and for once she allowed herself the small vanity of admiring her reflection. Mrs. Quinn entered without knocking, holding a velvet box. "From Mr. Harrow," she said, placing it on the dressing table. Inside lay a pair of ivory gloves, soft as breath, and a note written in Elias's restrained hand. "For your comfort, not your disguise." That was all it said, and yet the words wrapped around her like an embrace. The ballroom at Prescott Hall shimmered with crystal and gold. Rachel stepped into the light and felt for a moment every eye upon her. Her heart pounded, not from fear, but from awareness. She was being seen, measured, judged. The music began. Dancers spun across the floor in silks and brocade. Glasses clinked, laughter rose like perfume, and the whispers began again. "That's her. Poor thing. He must have promised her a house in Europe. She's staring too much. She's not staring enough." Rachel stood near the column, fingers resting lightly on the fluted marble. She had no dance card, no companion, and yet she stood straighter than the women beside her, her gaze never faltering. Then, from across the room, he appeared. Elias Harrow moved through the crowd like a ship cutting through fog. Dressed in black velvet and deep wine silk, his presence parted the whispers like waves. His scar caught the gaslight, and for a moment there was a hush, as if even the violins had paused. He approached Rachel without hesitation. "Miss Alder," he said, offering his gloved hand, "may I claim this dance?" She placed her hand in his. A murmur rippled through the room. Glasses stilled. Fans stopped fluttering. They moved onto the floor together, their bodies close but never too close, her gloved hand resting lightly in his. The waltz began, and the crowd fell away. Rachel did not speak, neither did Elias. But in the silence between them, something bloomed. The scent of his cologne, wood smoke and something darker, lingered between them. His hand at her waist was firm, respectful, and yet she could feel the tension beneath his restraint. Her eyes found his, not the scarred half, but the unguarded one. What she saw there was not pity nor pride. It was something more dangerous, recognition. When the music ended, he released her hand slowly. "You did not look away," he murmured. "I had no reason to," she answered, her voice low. Their gazes lingered, too long for propriety, too brief for satisfaction. As he turned to leave, Rachel became aware once more of the stares, the whispers, the fans raised like masks. But she no longer heard them. She had danced with Elias Harrow, and for the first time in years she felt not like a shadow on someone else's story, but a woman with one of her own. And Newport had taken notice. The Harrow estate in Providence stood like a monument carved out of grief and stone, half forgotten by the fashionable world that danced along the cliffs of Newport. Tucked beyond iron gates and framed by rows of ancient sycamores, the mansion did not boast the flamboyant opulence of the seaside palaces. Its grandeur was more somber, weather-darkened shutters, ivy climbing like veins across its facade, and silence thick as velvet hanging between its walls. Rachel arrived in a modest carriage just after mid-morning, her eyes lifting toward the second-floor windows, as if they might reveal something about the soul of the house. But the curtains were drawn, the glass opaque. Only the whisper of trees in the breeze and the distant creak of a garden swing gave movement to the stillness. Inside, the halls stretched long and dim, lit only by narrow panes of stained glass and the gleam of polished wood. A faded rug muffled her footsteps as she followed Mrs. Quinn, who walked with practiced ease, her keys clicking softly at her hip. "You'll find it quieter here than in Newport," the housekeeper remarked without looking back. "Mr. Harrow prefers it that way. There's a rhythm to this house. You'll come to hear it if you listen long enough." Rachel said nothing. Her gloved hands rested gently on the clasp of her reticule, her gaze drawn to the paintings lining the corridor. Portraits of Harrow's past, stiff collars, stern mouths, eyes that followed. As they reached the second floor, Mrs. Quinn paused before a closed door. The wood was darker than the others, its brass knob dulled with age. "This one stays locked," the housekeeper said quietly. "Per his instructions." Rachel glanced at her. "May I ask what's inside?" A long silence passed before Mrs. Quinn answered. "Memories, the kind that don't take kindly to sunlight." She moved on, but Rachel lingered. Her fingers itched to turn the handle, though she knew better. Not yet. Not without permission. Later that afternoon, after tea had been served and Mrs. Quinn retreated to her duties, Rachel wandered alone through the west wing. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that broke through the lace curtains, and the scent of lemon oil and old paper clung to the air. She passed a parlour where the furniture was covered in white cloth, as though the room were waiting for occupants who would never return. She paused at a small library, where a piano sat untouched, the sheet music still open to a nocturne long faded with age. And then, quite unexpectedly, she heard it, a faint scratching sound. soft, rhythmic. She followed it down a narrower corridor, past an old servant's staircase and a forgotten linen closet, until she found herself before a door ajar by only an inch. Pushing it open, Rachel stepped into a room that smelled of charcoal, lavender and paper. It was a nursery. The furniture was still there, though shrouded in white. A rocking chair, a small writing desk, a wardrobe painted with faded vines. On the wall, barely visible beneath a layer of dust, were drawings, charcoal sketches of ships, birds and faces, some crude, others hauntingly delicate. In the corner sat a girl, knees drawn to her chest, her head bowed over a sketchpad. Her hair was the colour of autumn leaves after the first frost, auburn, thick and slightly unkempt. She wore a plain brown dress and thick stockings, and her boots were too large for her slender frame. She did not look up. Rachel approached slowly. "You draw beautifully." The girl stiffened, her pencil stilling. "I didn't mean to intrude," Rachel added gently. "I heard the sound and followed it. I'm Rachel." The girl turned her head slightly, enough to reveal one eye, a clear hazel, rimmed in gold. She blinked once, then looked down again. "I'm not supposed to be here," she whispered. "Then we're both trespassers," Rachel replied, kneeling beside her. "Shall we make a pact of silence?" A pause, then the faintest nod. Rachel glanced at the page. The girl had sketched the hallway they'd just left, down to the crooked angle of the picture frames and the crack in the baseboard. Her eye for detail was astonishing. "What's your name?" "Lena," she said softly. "Short for Evelina." Rachel smiled. "A lovely name. Did you draw all these?" She gestured to the walls. Lena shrugged, but there was a flush of quiet pride in her cheeks. "I'd like to see more," Rachel said. "If you'll let me." Lena looked at her for a long moment, then turned back to her sketchpad. She handed it over without a word. Rachel sat beside her on the carpet, flipping slowly through the pages. There were portraits, one of a woman with sharp cheekbones and sorrowful eyes, another of a man in profile, broad-shouldered and bearded. Some images were of birds in flight, others of fire, smoke, and collapsing beams. Rachel froze. "This," she said softly, pointing to a sketch of flames licking the edges of a building. "Did you see this?" Lena's jaw tightened. She took the book back, closing it gently. "I remember everything," she murmured. Rachel said nothing more. Some silences were not meant to be filled. That evening, after Lena had disappeared down the servants' stairs without saying goodbye, Rachel found Elias in the study. He stood by the window, as always, a glass of scotch untouched in his hand. The fire cast long shadows behind him, licking at the dark wood paneling. "She's gifted," Rachel said without preamble. He turned, his expression unreadable. "Lena," she continued, "she's a remarkable observer, and kind, though she hides it well." Elias looked down at his glass. "She's my brother's daughter," Rachel nodded. "And the woman in the sketches? His wife, Genevieve." His voice was quiet, roughened by memory. "They died 6 years ago. Fire at the northern docks. Faulty oil lamp. I was there. I should have stopped it." She waited. "I sent them home early," he continued. "They wanted to stay for the celebration, but I insisted. Thought I was doing them a kindness. The fire started an hour later. By the time I reached the house, it was—" His voice broke. Rachel crossed the room without thinking. She placed her hand lightly on the back of a chair, close but not touching him. "You did not light the fire," she said softly. "I lit everything that led to it," he murmured. "The expansion, the contracts, the rush to deliver. My brother followed my ambition because he believed in me." "And Lena?" Rachel asked gently. "She's what remains." His jaw clenched. "I sent her away after, to a boarding school. She hated it, so I brought her here, but she doesn't speak to me. Not truly." "She speaks," Rachel said. "Not in words, in drawings." He turned to her then, and for the first time, Rachel saw not the scarred Tycoon, not the man society feared, but a brother, a guardian, a man folded in on his own regrets. "She needs more than walls and books," she said. "She needs to be seen." Elias nodded slowly, as if hearing the truth from someone else's mouth for the first time. Behind them, Mrs. Quinn stepped into the doorway, silent as dusk. Her eyes flicked between the two of them, and for a moment her features softened. "I served Elias's mother," she said. "Watched pride and silence turn a household cold. Don't let this house eat her the way it nearly ate you." Then she turned and disappeared down the hall, her keys tapping against her apron. Rachel looked once more at Elias. His gaze was distant, fixed on the empty hearth. "Will you let me help her?" she asked quietly. His answer came not in words, but in the way his shoulders sank, the way his hand released the glass untouched, the way his eyes, dark and storm-worn, finally met hers with something that resembled trust. Outside, the wind stirred the sycamores. Within the house, a door that had long been locked began to shift on its hinges, and somewhere in the east wing, Lena was drawing by lamplight, her fingers moving across the paper as if tracing a memory she was finally ready to share. The Harrow dining room in Providence had once been the setting of elegant Christmases, wedding toasts, and council meetings of shipping magnates who had built their empires on wind and steel. Now it served as a place of reluctant gatherings, an echo of grandeur that had aged with its master. The mahogany walls gleamed under the weight of polish and candlelight, and the long dining table, set with silverware and bone china, stretched like a stage awaiting its players. It was Lawrence Harrow who had insisted on the formal dinner, his voice honeyed with persuasion. "We must remind the board we are still very much alive," he had said with a smile as flawless as his tailoring. "Let them drink our wine and taste our stability." Elias had agreed reluctantly, and Rachel suspected he did so more to avoid another debate than out of true conviction. She had learned, in the quiet days at the Providence estate, that Elias preferred solitude not for comfort, but for safety. The invitations had gone out swiftly. Investors, old family friends, and 2 editors from the Newport Herald were among those who arrived that Friday evening, dressed in crisp collars and satin gloves, the scent of privilege clinging to their shoulders like cologne. Rachel, standing near the mantel in a simple gown of storm-grey silk, observed them with the wariness of a lamb set loose among lions. It was not until the main course was cleared that Lawrence struck. With a flourish, he lifted a crystal glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice cutting effortlessly through the murmur of conversation. "Before we move on to dessert, I thought it only fitting to reintroduce a piece of Harrow history. A small reminder of the man whose vision built all this." 2 footmen, as if on cue, stepped aside to reveal a large object draped in velvet resting on an easel. Rachel's breath caught. Elias, seated beside her, remained perfectly still. Lawrence pulled back the velvet, revealing a portrait of Elias painted over a decade earlier, before the fire, before the scars, before tragedy had burned its claim into his life. In the painting he stood tall and proud, his face untouched, his jaw firm, his eyes fierce and ambitious. It was a handsome image, glorified in the way only commissioned oil paintings can be. Gasps rippled through the room, followed by the quiet rustle of silk and fan. Rachel felt the temperature shift. The glances began, curious, then furtive, then thinly veiled with pity. No one spoke, but their silence shouted. Elias's hand twitched at his side, then clenched into a fist on his thigh. His jaw was rigid, his eyes locked not on the portrait, but on the tablecloth before him. Rachel could feel the thunder behind his silence. Lawrence tilted his glass. "A remarkable likeness, don't you think?" Rachel rose slowly, as though guided not by impulse, but by something deeper, something necessary. Her gloves were smooth against the curve of her glass as she lifted it. She smiled gently. "I find it quite touching," she said, her voice steady, clear. But I believe the book of Samuel said it best. Man looketh on the outward appearance, but the Lord looketh on the heart. A beat of silence. Then, slowly, a few guests lowered their eyes. A woman coughed. A fork clinked against a plate. Rachel sat down again. Elias had not moved, but she felt the smallest shift in his posture. A subtle loosening. A breath not quite held. Lawrence said nothing, but the gleam in his eyes dulled slightly. The rest of the evening passed in cordial frost. When the guests had gone, and the last carriage wheels faded into the night, Rachel found herself in the east wing hallway, alone in thought. She had changed into her cotton dressing gown, the soft fabric trailing behind her as she wandered toward the small study where Mrs. Quinn kept the household books. She hadn't intended to go there, not truly, but something had been gnawing at her for days. Odd numbers, fluctuating figures, a discrepancy in what was being said and what was being spent. The ledgers were stacked neatly in a locked glass cabinet, but the keys had long since been entrusted to her by Mrs. Quinn, who regarded her with a quiet approval that needed no words. The flickering lamplight danced across columns of ink as Rachel turned the pages. She was not a trained accountant, but she understood order, patterns, details. The way the mind of a woman raised in parsonage could see a lie in a ledger, just as she might detect false charity in a sermon. A payment marked for a Sunday, a day no Harrow office had ever opened. Another invoice repeated, but with a different signature. Shipping weights that made no sense for the cargo described. She ran her finger down the columns, her brows furrowed. "I thought I'd find you here." Rachel turned sharply. Mrs. Quinn stood in the doorway, a candle holder in her hand. Her expression was unsurprised. "I didn't mean to pry," Rachel said, closing the book gently. "You're not prying," Mrs. Quinn replied. She stepped inside, setting the candle down. "You're doing what no one else has dared for years." Rachel hesitated. "Have you seen this before?" "I've suspected," the housekeeper said. "But suspicion is a lonely thing, especially in a house like this. Why didn't you say anything to Elias?" "Because he already carries too much," she said simply. "And because there are ghosts in these books. His father, his uncles, the men who ran the Harrow name into smoke and splinters. Elias has spent half his life trying to rebuild a legacy with rot in its roots." Rachel pressed a hand to the ledger. "Someone's still feeding that rot." Mrs. Quinn nodded. "I can help you look, quietly. No need to stir the fire unless we know what's burning." That night, Rachel returned to her room with ink on her fingertips and resolve in her spine. She could not sleep. Not for the cold, not for the silence, not for the truth. By morning, Elias had left early for the shipyard. When he returned, Rachel waited for him in the small parlor with a decanter and 2 glasses. "You were right," she said softly as he entered. He paused, his brow creasing. "About what?" "This house, this family, the rot." She handed him a sheet of paper with the copied entries. "Someone is forging transactions, Elias. Someone inside your circle." He took the paper, read it without a word, then sat heavily in the armchair across from her. "I found ledgers like this after the fire," he said. "When I took over the accounts myself, there were bribes, falsified shipments, funds redirected. I erased what I could, paid what I had to. I thought I had stopped it." "You didn't," Rachel said gently. "But you tried." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, his dark eyes filled with something raw and heavy. "I brought you here to prove you could endure," he murmured. "And now you're offering me something I hadn't dared hope for." "What's that?" He leaned forward, his voice almost breaking. "Allegiance." The word settled between them, heavier than love, more intimate than a kiss. Rachel reached out, her fingers brushing the back of his hand. The contact was brief, but it sparked through her like a confession. "You're not alone in this," she said. He closed his eyes, and in that silence she felt him surrender, not to her, but to the possibility of trust. Outside, the lamps of Providence flickered to life as dusk fell over the estate. Within those walls, a different kind of light began to stir, faint but undeniable, a light not of chandeliers or candle flame, but of something far rarer: hope. The early days of June brought a deceptive calm to Providence. The sun glimmered against the harbour, the scent of salt and tar drifting through the open windows of the Harrow estate. Ships groaned in the distance, their sails unfurling like white wings over the water. Inside, however, the air was thick with unease. Rachel could sense it in the way Mrs. Quinn's footsteps grew brisker, in the way Elias's voice became more clipped when the subject of finances arose, and most of all, in the way Lawrence Harrow seemed to haunt every room he entered, smiling too easily, speaking too softly. It was on a humid afternoon that Rachel found herself drawn once again to the library. The room smelled of oak and parchment, the heavy curtains drawn to protect the books from the glare. The quiet there was different from other parts of the house, more contemplative, but also more suffocating. Dust motes drifted lazily in the air, and on the great mahogany desk lay an opened account book, its pages neat, orderly, and, she could not help but notice, too perfect. She had not forgotten the ledgers she had examined weeks before, nor Elias's weary admission that corruption had once rotted his family's business. Yet something in those numbers refused to rest in her mind. A sum too precise, a date too improbable. She leaned closer, running her fingers along the spine of the old family Bible that sat near the accounts, its leather cracked with age. It seemed oddly misplaced among the ledgers and inkpots. When she lifted it, it felt lighter than it should. The moment her fingers pressed against the back cover, she heard the faintest hollow sound. Her heart quickened. With care, she slid her thumb beneath the edge and pried open a false compartment. Inside were several folded sheets of paper, the ink still sharp, the handwriting unmistakably elegant. She recognized the signature before she even read the content: Lawrence Harrow. The invoices were written to companies that did not exist. Shell names and false addresses tied to docks Rachel had visited on carriage rides with Elias. One in particular caught her attention: Merriman & Co. She knew that name. Elias had once mentioned Merriman as a firm that had gone bankrupt years ago. Her pulse thudded. Someone had resurrected a dead company on paper and made it appear alive. She replaced the papers, hiding the Bible back in place, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. When Mrs. Quinn entered the room a few moments later, Rachel's composure was nearly gone. "Who has access to this library besides Mr. Harrow?" she asked, her voice lower than usual. "Lawrence, of course," Mrs. Quinn answered, setting a silver tray upon the desk. "He comes and goes as he pleases. His office is just across the hall." She studied Rachel's expression and added, "What have you found?" Rachel hesitated, torn between duty and fear. "Proof," she whispered at last. "Proof that someone is using Elias's own name to bleed his company." Mrs. Quinn's face hardened, the lines around her eyes deepening. "Then you must be careful. Lawrence smiles like a gentleman but strikes like a merchant with a debt to hide." Rachel nodded. "If Elias hears this from me, he may doubt me. If he hears it from Lawrence first, he'll doubt himself," Mrs. Quinn finished grimly. "That's the oldest trick of pride." Later that evening, Elias returned from the docks. His coat carried the scent of smoke and sea brine, his shoulders heavy with exhaustion. Rachel met him at the door, her resolve steadying with every step. "I found something," she began, holding the Bible in her hands. "In the library, someone's forged invoices, all bearing Lawrence's signature." Elias looked at her sharply. "Forged invoices?" "Yes. Payments to companies that don't exist, names that died years ago." He took the Bible from her, flipping through the pages, his brow furrowing. "You're certain?" "I am." Before he could respond, Lawrence entered the hall, removing his gloves with leisurely precision. "What's this?" he asked, with a mild tone that disguised the venom beneath. "A sermon, perhaps? Or has Miss Alder taken to auditing scripture?" Elias's eyes lifted, his jaw tightening. "Lawrence, what business have you conducted under the name Merriman & Co.?" Lawrence blinked, then laughed lightly. Merriman, my dear cousin, that firm hasn't existed in years. You know that as well as I do. Yet their invoices sit here with your signature. For the first time, Lawrence's composure faltered, but only for a moment. Ah, he said smoothly, so Miss Alder has been reading your private records. How very industrious. Rachel's cheeks flushed, but not with shame. The records were hidden, not private. That distinction matters. Lawrence turned to Elias, lowering his voice. And this is the company you keep, cousin. A woman rummaging through sacred books as though she were searching for gossip. You risk more than embarrassment, Elias. Investors are already whispering. They question your judgment. I care little for their whispers, Elias said coldly. You should, Lawrence countered softly. You should, if you mean to keep Harrow shipping afloat. The silence that followed was suffocating. Rachel could feel the tension radiating from Elias, the pride of a man cornered, the fear of one who had built his fortune upon brittle glass. Enough, he said at last. Both of you. He turned to Rachel, his voice lower now, but distant. Leave the papers with me. I will see to it myself. Her throat tightened. Elias, he did not meet her eyes. You've done enough, Rachel. Those words struck harder than she expected. She turned to go, her vision blurring as she walked up the staircase. The sound of Lawrence's quiet, satisfied exhale followed her like a curse. That night, Rachel returned to her room, the small chamber she had occupied when she first arrived. She had not slept there since Elias asked her to move to the larger guest suite, but now the distance felt symbolic, inevitable. The moonlight cast long silver bars across the floor, touching the edges of her trunk, the mirror, the chair where her shawl lay forgotten. She sat on the bed and tried to still her trembling hands. She had come here to bring order to a life torn by loss, to build something honest in a house of secrets. And yet the moment she had touched the truth, it had turned to ashes in her grasp. A faint rustle at the door broke the silence. She rose, half expecting Mrs. Quinn, but there was no one there. Only a folded sheet of paper slipped beneath the threshold. When she unfolded it, her breath caught. It was a sketch. A portrait of Elias drawn in charcoal, but not as she usually saw him, not the man bound by silence or pride. In this drawing his eyes were soft, his expression unguarded, his scar rendered with such tenderness that it no longer seemed a wound. At the bottom of the page was a single initial, L. Rachel pressed the paper to her chest. She could almost see Lena's small, ink-stained fingers sliding it under the door, could almost feel the girl's quiet plea in the gesture. Don't leave us. Rachel sat for a long time, watching the moonlight creep across the floor until it reached her feet. When she finally stood, it was with a calm she had not felt since arriving at Harrow House. Elias might doubt her, Lawrence might slander her, but she would not abandon them, not the man fighting his ghosts, nor the girl drawing her memories into light. The next morning, Rachel rose before dawn. She dressed simply, tying her hair into a loose braid. The library was still when she entered, the air cool from the night. She opened the Bible once more, removed the hidden papers, and laid them across the desk. Each invoice bore Lawrence's hand, each a thread in a web of deceit. The names, Merriman, Caldwell, and Finch, Eastgate traders, were all ghosts, yet one detail stood out. Every payment had been funneled through a firm registered in New York, under a company name she recognized faintly from an article she had once read in the Evening Post. Leighton Maritime Holdings. Rachel's pulse quickened. It was a shell company controlled by Lawrence Harrow himself. She gathered the papers carefully, tucking them beneath her shawl. The path ahead was dangerous, but her resolve was absolute. Outside, the first light of morning broke across the horizon, spilling gold over the sea. The gulls cried, the waves struck the cliffs, and the wind carried with it the faint scent of salt and rain. Rachel looked toward the harbour and whispered to herself, "You will not destroy him, Lawrence, not while I still have breath to stand." The words were quiet, but they held the weight of a promise. A promise stronger than fear, sharper than pride, and far more enduring than revenge. The breakers glittered like a palace carved from starlight. Torches lined the winding drive, their flames dancing in the salt-heavy air, casting golden flickers against the marble columns of the grand facade. Carriages arrived in procession, their wheels crackling over crushed seashells, delivering New York airs and Boston dowagers, Newport debutantes and European visitors, all adorned in velvet, satin and illusion. Inside, the ballroom swelled with music and mystery. Candlelight shimmered on mirrored walls, magnifying jewels and secrets alike. Masks concealed identities only as much as pride allowed. Behind every plume and satin ribbon, familiar glances betrayed old rivalries, forbidden romances, and rumors freshly sown. Rachel Alder stood at the edge of the Golden Gallery, her hands clasped before her, the soft fall of her grey silk gown brushing the parquet floor. Her silver mask, plain and without embellishment, shielded only part of her face. It was a deliberate choice. Not to disappear, but to remind the room that she had nothing to hide. She had not intended to attend the masquerade. It was Mrs. Quinn who had laid the invitation on her writing desk earlier that week, a silent nudge wrapped in embossed vellum. And it was Lena who had left a single dove feather on her pillow the night before, a quiet encouragement from the girl who rarely spoke, but always noticed. Rachel had dressed alone, with no maid to pin her hair or adjust the fall of her hem. She wore no borrowed diamonds, only a small cameo brooch at her throat and gloves just beginning to fray. Yet as she crossed the threshold of that room, where chandeliers rained light like frost and laughter floated like perfume, she held herself with the poise of a queen without a throne. For a time, she walked unseen, unnamed. Couples swirled to the strains of a Strauss waltz, their silks rustling, their steps precise. She passed whispering women in embroidered masks, men whose wine-flushed laughter held more cruelty than charm. But she had come prepared for the scrutiny, the games, the judgment. What she had not prepared for was the sharpness of Lawrence Harrow's voice echoing across the marbled floor. "Some masks," he said to a gathered group near the musicians, "hide more than faces. Some conceal ambitions, more pointed than polite." Rachel froze. Lawrence stood resplendent in black and ivory, his mask a sweeping thing of Venetian lace and gold. He held a crystal glass as if he were delivering a toast. "I dare say," he continued, "that even fortune hunters must grow tired of dressing like governesses. Or perhaps that's part of the charm. A wolf in plain wool." The group laughed, too loudly, too quickly. The sound echoed like ice breaking. Rachel stepped forward, the train of her gown silent behind her. Her breath was calm, her heartbeat anything but. Lawrence's eyes locked onto hers. "Ah," he said, with a bow deeper than mockery required. "Miss Alder, or shall I say, Miss Harrow-to-be. That is still the arrangement, isn't it?" The laughter faded, heads turned, conversations fell into hush. "Or perhaps," he added with a glittering smile, "we've all been mistaken. Elias, would you care to enlighten us as to this young lady's station?" The music stopped. Rachel's eyes swept the room. Faces gleamed behind feathers and jeweled masks, curious, calculating, waiting for a fall. And from the far end of the ballroom, Elias Harrow emerged. He had come alone, as always, dressed in a dark navy coat lined with silver thread, his mask a simple band across his eyes. His presence stirred the room like a shifting tide. He did not speak. Rachel turned toward him. Their gazes met, his steady, hers searching. But he said nothing. The silence was a wound. Rachel stepped forward alone. She did not raise her voice, but the stillness made it carry. "I am not here to defend myself," she said, her voice low and crystalline. "Because there is nothing I need to hide, not my past, not my name, not the truth." Murmurs rose. She unfolded a single sheet of paper from the clutch at her waist. The pale parchment trembled in her gloved hand, though her voice did not. "These are invoices," she said, forged under dead company names, passed through shell accounts tied to Leighton Maritime Holdings, a business operated quietly, discreetly by Lawrence Harrow. A gasp. Rachel turned slowly. I found them in the Harrow estate, hidden in a family Bible. The same man who questions my honor used Elias's legacy to launder theft into legitimacy. Lawrence's mask cracked, not in fabric, but in expression. His smile faded, his jaw clenched. This is slander, he hissed. It is truth, Rachel replied, and I will stand by it even if no one else does. The silence now was no longer curious. It was electric. The ballroom held its breath. Elias took a step forward, but it was too late. Rachel turned, her spine straight. Her dignity wrapped around her like silk. She walked away. The marble floor echoed with the soft fall of her steps. No one stopped her. No one dared. Outside, the sea wind hit her like a baptism. She pulled off her mask and inhaled deeply, letting the salt sting her throat and clear her vision. She had come with truth. She had not been met with defense, nor with alliance, and yet she had not crumbled. The tears did not fall until the carriage door shut behind her. Even then, they were silent, dignified, the kind only a woman betrayed by silence could shed. Inside the ballroom, conversation resumed, hesitant, broken, but something had shifted. The sparkle of the evening dulled, the music stuttered when it resumed, and in the far corner, Elias Harrow stood unmoving, still staring at the space where Rachel had stood. His hands were clenched at his sides, his jaw was locked, and in his silence, shame bloomed darker than scandal. He had built ships strong enough to cross oceans, but tonight he had failed to build a bridge to the one woman who had stood before the world, unmasked, for him. The air in Providence hung heavy with the weight of an approaching storm. By late afternoon, clouds like bruises had gathered over the harbour, and the scent of salt was thick, pressing against the windows of the Harrow estate like a threat. The wind rose in sharp gusts that rattled the panes, bending the trees and stirring the ivy clinging to the stone walls. Rachel stood at the parlour window, one hand resting against the glass, watching the first drops of rain stain the cobbled drive. Lightning cracked silently over the distant masts of the shipyard. She didn't flinch. The storm outside felt like a mirror to the one within. It had been 2 days since the ball at the Breakers, 2 days since she had stood alone before the masked and jewelled elite, exposing truth without shield or ally. 2 days since Elias, silent in the crowd, had let her walk away without a word. He had not spoken to her since. He had not even looked at her. She had taken her meals in her room, exchanged only brief, necessary words with Mrs. Quinn, and avoided the West Wing where his study remained shrouded in lamplight and regret. Still, she had stayed. Not out of pride, not even out of hope, but because Lena was still here, and so was the truth, and Rachel had never been the kind of woman to leave a wound untended. As the storm deepened, thunder rolling low and constant across the bay, Rachel made her way upstairs. A flicker of candlelight under the nursery door caught her eye. She knocked once, gently, then pushed it open. Lena sat curled on the window seat, her sketchbook open on her lap, though she wasn't drawing. She stared out at the lightning-streaked sky, her face pale, her body curled tight. "I couldn't sleep," the girl said without turning. Rachel crossed the room, her steps silent on the worn rug. She reached for the oil lamp and adjusted the flame to a softer glow. "I couldn't either," she said. "The wind sounds angry." Lena nodded, "like the house is arguing with the world." Rachel sat beside her. "When I was your age, I used to think the thunder was God shouting over the noise of people who had forgotten to listen." Lena looked up at her then, hazel eyes wide and searching. "Did you forget?" Rachel smiled faintly. "Once. But I'm remembering again." She reached for a book, resting on the nearby shelf, its spine frayed, its title long faded. She opened it and began to read aloud, her voice soft and low. The story was old, familiar, a tale of a sailor lost at sea and the woman who waited, certain of his return despite every tide. As the words filled the nursery, the storm outside swelled. Rain lashed the windows, and the wind howled through the eaves like a grieving choir. And then, behind them, the door creaked. Rachel turned. Elias stood in the threshold, his coat damp from the rain, his hair mussed by wind. He looked tired, the kind of tired that sits not on the body but in the soul. Lena froze, clutching her book, unsure whether to stay or flee. Rachel closed the book. "Come in," she said quietly. Elias stepped inside, his boots soundless on the floor. He looked at Lena first. "Your aunt," he said, "would have loved to see you in this room again." Lena said nothing, but her fingers relaxed slightly on the edge of the page. Elias turned to Rachel. "May I speak with you?" Rachel nodded. Lena stood, and with a glance between them, slipped from the room like smoke, closing the door behind her. Elias didn't speak at first. He moved to the center of the room, where the firelight from the hallway reached only in golden streaks. Rachel remained seated, though every part of her braced. "I have spent the last 48 hours reliving every second of that night," he said at last, his voice low, hoarse. "Every word you said, every word I didn't." Rachel said nothing. "I was afraid," he continued, pacing once, then stopping before the hearth. "Afraid of what standing beside you would cost you. Afraid of what Lawrence would unleash. Afraid that I would drag you into the wreckage that follows my name." Rachel stood slowly. "And so you chose silence." "Yes." His voice broke. "And in doing so, I proved every cruel whisper right. Not about you, but about me." He turned toward her then, and in his face she saw the weight of it all, the years, the scars, the pride that had protected him and at the same time isolated him. "I believed you," he said. "Every word. I never doubted. But I didn't defend you. And for that," his voice trembled, "there is no defense." Rachel stepped closer, the distance between them thick with things unsaid. She looked up at him, her eyes shining not with tears, but with a fierce, aching clarity. "I did not need your defense," she said. "I needed your voice, not to silence the others, but to stand beside mine." "I see that now," he whispered. They stood like that for a long moment, the storm pressing against the house, the room holding its breath. Rachel reached out, her fingers brushing lightly against his hand. A simple touch, barely there. And yet it spoke of forgiveness, of sorrow, of the fragile bridge rebuilding between them. Elias lifted her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles. Tender, reverent, brief. Their eyes met. The silence between them shifted from pain to promise. Then a knock. Mrs. Quinn appeared in the doorway, her face lined with concern. "A message from the yard," she said. "One of the Harrow ships was rerouted. They say it was an error in paperwork. But the loss—" She hesitated. "It's significant." Elias took the paper, reading it in a single glance, his jaw tensed. "Merriman Holdings," he muttered. "The same name, the same lie." Rachel stepped forward. "Lawrence." He nodded. "He's made his final move." "Then so must we," she said, her voice steely. "We take it public. We show them the truth before he poisons it." Elias looked at her, astonishment flickering in his eyes. "You would do that? After everything?" Rachel stepped closer. "You've built a name from ashes. I'm not afraid of standing in the fire with you." Their eyes held. The storm outside surged, lightning splitting the sky. But in that room, in the house that once held only ghosts, something else took shape. Not forgiveness. Not yet, but alliance. And that, for the first time, felt like the beginning of something neither of them had dared believe in again. The morning light over Providence was not gentle. It arrived sharp and unflinching, illuminating every rooftop and casting long, accusatory shadows against the stone of the Harrow estate. The storm had passed in the night, but it had left behind a sky so clear it felt brittle, as though the world had been scrubbed clean of lies and would now demand truth in full. Inside her chambers, Rachel Alder stood before the mirror in a gown of slate grey, the fabric matte and modest. The sleeves were long, the cuffs ivory and buttoned to the wrist, the bodice unadorned. There was no lace, no frill, no jewelled pin. She had braided her hair into a crown at her head, its simplicity elegant, its purpose clear. She was not dressing for beauty, she was dressing for war. She descended the stairs to find Elias Harrow waiting in the front hall, his coat already buttoned, his cravat pinned with a jet-black stone. His face was calm, but the stillness in his posture was a mask for tension coiled beneath the surface. In his hand, he held a small leather portfolio, worn, weathered, filled with the weight of truth. When he looked up at her, something in his eyes shifted. Not surprise, not admiration, but a kind of reverence. He offered no compliment, only a nod, as if to say, "You are exactly as you must be." Mrs. Quinn stood nearby, a folded document in her hand, sealed with the red wax of Harrow family law. She handed it to Elias without ceremony. "You may want to read that aloud when the time comes," she said. "They'll need to hear it from blood." Rachel looked at the housekeeper, saw the steel beneath her quiet, and nodded once. "Thank you." Indeed, the carriage ride to the Providence Maritime boardroom was brief, but the silence inside stretched like a taut rope. Elias did not speak. Rachel did not need him to. She sat with her hands folded in her lap, the folder of evidence secured beside her. Outside, the streets passed in orderly rows of brick and cobblestone, but Rachel saw none of it. Her mind was already inside the boardroom, already facing the polished wood table, the white-haired men, the sneers, the raised brows, the disbelief. The carriage stopped. Elias stepped out first, then turned to help her down. His hand lingered on hers a moment longer than necessary. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. Rachel met his gaze. "Yes, I do." The boardroom was a cathedral of industry. Long table of dark oak, high windows framed in brocade, portraits of past magnates staring down with judgment. The walls were lined with maps of trade routes, charts of export, oil paintings of ships long decommissioned. And at the far end of the room sat 12 men, most in their 60s, all wearing expressions shaped by decades of unchecked power. They looked up as Elias entered. They blinked as Rachel followed. The silence was immediate. One man cleared his throat. Another shifted in his seat. Not one stood. "Gentlemen," Elias said, his voice as smooth as the grain of the table, "you know me. You know this company. And today you will know the truth." He stepped aside. "Miss Alder will speak first." Rachel moved to the center of the room. Her steps were steady. She did not tremble. "My name is Rachel Alder," she began, her voice clear, unhurried. "And I am not here as a guest. I am here as a witness." She placed the folder on the table and opened it. Slowly, deliberately, she removed the forged invoices, the duplicate shipping logs, the false contracts filed under dead company names. Each sheet bore Lawrence Harrow's signature. Each paper was a nail in a coffin long overdue. "This," she said, holding up a document, "is a contract between Harrow Shipping and Merriman & Co., a firm that ceased to exist 6 years ago. And this," she laid down another, "is a payment order authorized by Lawrence Harrow to a shell company in New York, a company which he owns." There was a murmur, a cough, the shifting of weight in finely tailored suits. "Over the last 2 years," Rachel continued, "these false companies have funneled funds from Harrow Shipping's accounts, disguising losses and rerouting profits. This fraud was not subtle. It was strategic. It was not about desperation. It was about control." She stepped back. A beat of silence passed. Then the door burst open. Lawrence entered like a man used to owning the room, his coat impeccable, his hair perfectly parted, his mouth already forming a smile. "I do hope I'm not late," he said, his voice light. "I heard there was to be a presentation. Imagine my surprise when I discovered it was being delivered by someone who doesn't even sit on the board." "Sit down, Lawrence," one of the men muttered. Lawrence laughed. "Oh, come now. Are we seriously entertaining the accusations of a woman scorned? Really, Elias, is this how you govern your house now? Allowing a governess to run audits in your stead?" Rachel did not flinch. She simply turned to Elias and gave a nod. He stepped forward, unfolded a single document, and began to read. "It is with full knowledge of its implications that I submit this statement," he said, voice steady. "The evidence Miss Alder has presented is accurate. I have reviewed each document personally. I have verified the falsification with 2 captains whose routes were affected. I have compared the handwriting. And I have received written confirmation that the accounts linked to Leighton Maritime Holdings are registered under Lawrence Harrow's name." Lawrence's smile cracked. "I have also," Elias continued, "discovered that the terms of our grandfather's will, which were recently re-examined, contain a clause found by Mrs. Agnes Quinn that clearly states, 'Any heir proven to have knowingly defrauded the Harrow enterprise shall forfeit his claim to the family trust.'" Elias lifted the sealed document Mrs. Quinn had given him. "It is signed, witnessed, and still binding." The room was silent. Lawrence took a step forward, color draining from his face. "You can't—" "You did," Elias said, voice now cold as steel. "You did this to yourself." One of the older men, a man who had sat through the rise and fall of many names, sighed and said, "Then it's unanimous. Lawrence Harrow's position is forfeit, as is his share in the Harrow Trust." The final blow was struck with formality. No one raised a voice. No one defended him. Lawrence turned to Elias, rage twisting his face, but it was already too late. He left the room without another word. The board adjourned soon after, quietly, with glances toward Rachel that were no longer filled with scorn, but with something resembling respect. Outside, the wind had picked up again, but it was no longer cruel. Rachel stood beneath the portico, the folder clutched in her hands. Elias stepped beside her, not speaking, simply watching the sky shift from grey to silver. "You were brilliant," he said at last. She turned to him, her eyes soft but resolute. "I only did what needed to be done." Elias reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her temple. The gesture was light, but it carried weight. He had once watched her walk away in silence. He would not make that mistake again. "You've saved more than a company today," he said. "You've saved my name." Rachel shook her head gently. "No, I gave the truth a voice. You are the one who chose to hear it." In the days that followed, the city whispered a different kind of rumor. No longer was Rachel Alder called a fortune hunter. No longer was she dismissed with narrowed eyes and cruel smiles. Now she was called something else, a lady of Harrow, a woman of iron and silk. And for the first time since she had arrived in Providence, she felt not like a stranger walking among ghosts, but like a name worth speaking in the daylight. The morning broke not with trumpet calls or 1,000 flower petals strewn upon polished marble, but with soft winds rustling the high trees around St. Mary's Chapel. The summer sky above Newport was pale and brushed with wisps of silver, the kind of sky that did not announce a celebration, but quietly blessed it. There were no liveried footmen lining the chapel steps, no socialites craning their necks behind parasols, no orchestra rehearsing a waltz that would echo through marble halls. Instead, the chapel doors stood open to the breeze, and the scent of salt from the nearby bay mingled with the faint perfume of wild roses creeping up its stone walls. Inside, the pews were nearly empty, and yet, to Rachel Alder, there had never been a more sacred congregation. On the front row sat Lena, her gloved hands clasped tightly in her lap, her cheeks flushed with something between awe and wonder. The girl wore a dress of pale lavender and carried a small bouquet of lilies Rachel had gathered that morning herself. Next to her sat Mrs. Quinn, spine as straight as ever, eyes suspiciously bright beneath her velvet hat. And beside her, wearing a mauve shawl pinned with a brooch shaped like an anchor, was Aunt Harriet, who'd arrived from Boston just 2 nights prior, her dry wit softened by the gentleness of the occasion. Rachel stood at the threshold of the chapel for a long breath before stepping inside. Her gown was not of silk or imported lace, but of soft ivory muslin, stitched by her own hands and trimmed at the hem with a discreet ribbon of forget-me-not blue. Her hair was pinned in a modest chignon, a few wisps trailing loose in the summer air, and her only adornment was a single pearl at her throat, a gift from Mrs. Quinn, passed down from Elias's mother. At the altar stood Elias Harrow, tall and composed, his suit the colour of ash, the same one he had worn at the board meeting that changed everything. There was no boutonniere, no pomp, only a glint of silver in the cufflinks and a stillness in his breath as Rachel walked toward him, step by step, the wooden floor beneath her whispering approval. The Reverend was an elderly man with gentle eyes and a voice like parchment turning in a quiet room. When he asked who gave this woman, Aunt Harriet stood and said clearly, "She gives herself," and then sat again, her hands folded, her heart rattling in her chest like a hymn remembered from childhood. The vows were not read from cards, but spoken from memory, words chosen in private and practiced with trembling lips in the dark. "I will not promise you ease," Elias said, his gaze fixed on Rachel's face, "but I will offer you truth. All of it," Rachel answered, voice steady, "and I will not promise perfection, but I will offer you presence. Always." There were no gasps, no applause, only silence heavy and profound, and then the sound of two hands clasping as the Reverend declared them husband and wife. Elias bent his head, not in command, but in reverence, and pressed a kiss to Rachel's hand. It was the simplest of weddings, and yet it echoed louder in their hearts than any grand affair could. They walked from the chapel side by side, their fingers laced together, no carriage waiting at the steps. Instead, they took the path through the trees behind the chapel, the same dirt trail where Elias had once walked as a boy beside his father, long before pride and loss had built walls inside him. The Harrow estate awaited at the end of the path, stone, ivy-clad, no longer imposing but familiar. A home that had once been filled with shadows now opened its doors to light. That afternoon, with the sun pouring golden warmth through the parlour windows, Elias disappeared briefly into the study. When he returned, he carried a small box of polished walnut, worn at the edges but still strong. He placed it in Rachel's hands without a word. She opened it slowly. Inside lay the Harrow family signet ring, its face engraved with the Harrow crest, waves, compass, and the Latin word veritas. The ring had once belonged to Elias's father, and had not been worn since the night of the fire that stole his brother, his sister-in-law, and nearly his soul. Rachel looked up at him, startled. "I buried it in a drawer the day I gave up on legacies," Elias said quietly, "but you've given me reason to believe again." She took the ring and, rather than sliding it onto her finger, pressed it gently into his palm. "Then wear it for the family we are now," she whispered, "not for the ghosts." He did. Later, in the evening's amber light, Rachel climbed the stairs with Lena to the sitting room. Together, they unwrapped a long roll of parchment paper, carefully framed and tied with twine. Rachel's fingers trembled as she undid the knot. Inside was Lena's final sketch, the one she had refused to show for days, blushing and skittish whenever Rachel asked. But now, with the hush of twilight falling and a sense of safety she had never known before, Lena stood beside Rachel and watched as the drawing was revealed. It was a portrait, not of Elias alone as everyone had expected, but of three figures seated together on the veranda steps. Elias with his scar and gentle eyes, Rachel beside him, her hands folded in her lap, and Lena in the center, cradling her sketchbook, her expression serene and open. There was no grandeur in the scene, no symbolism or excess, just three people held by one another's presence. Rachel pressed her hand to her mouth. "It's beautiful." Lena shrugged, suddenly shy again. "It's just us." And it was. Rachel framed it that same night and hung it above the fireplace where once had hung Elias's youthful portrait, handsome, unscarred, but cold. She replaced it without ceremony, only with quiet reverence. Later, as dusk deepened into indigo, Rachel stood at the hearth, the warmth of the fire flickering against her skin. Elias stepped in behind her and did not speak. He simply slipped his arms around her waist and rested his chin against her shoulder. The portrait watched them. No masks, no pretense. Rachel turned slightly, her cheek brushing against his. "Did you ever imagine this day?" Elias inhaled, his breath steady and calm. "No," he said, "but it's better than I could have dared." They did not speak of future plans or the storms that still might come. They did not speak of titles or society or the scandals that would slowly fade from memory. They simply stood as husband and wife in a home no longer built on grief, but on grace. And somewhere nearby, Lena sketched in her quiet corner, drawing not from longing but from joy. The Harrow name would carry forward, not in whispered rumors or scathing headlines, but in love quietly earned, fiercely kept, and bravely shared. Autumn had crept into Providence with a hush, cloaking the city in amber leaves and air that smelled faintly of cedar and salt. The bustle of the summer season was long behind them now, and the Harrow household had settled into a rhythm that felt neither grand nor modest, only right. It had been 4 months since the wedding, and the house, once so silent, now carried the soft, human music of domestic life, the ticking of clocks, the rustle of pages turned by a fireplace, the sound of Lena's pencil scratching against paper in the corner window seat where she now loved to sit, legs tucked beneath her, head bowed with focus. On this particular morning, Rachel stood in the parlor, hands clasped loosely behind her back, watching the light filter through the linen curtains. The scent of freshly brewed tea mingled with the faint tang of the sea that always seemed to follow Elias home. It was a peace she had never dared imagine, a peace that grew not from luxury or social standing, but from small kindnesses repeated daily. Behind her, she heard the front door close. "Is it done?" she asked without turning. Elias stepped into the room, shoulders dusted with the sea mist of the early morning. He was dressed in his work coat, the one with the leather elbow patches, and there was a blueprint tube slung under his arm, like a soldier's rifle. His boots were muddied, his jaw faintly shadowed, but his eyes were lit with something between fatigue and triumph. "It's standing," he said, "and it's stronger than the last." Rachel turned slowly, a smile blooming on her lips. "You didn't use the original mooring placement, did you?" "I used yours," he said, "the way you aligned it with the rocky slope. It worked." She crossed the room and rested a hand on his lapel, brushing away a leaf stuck to the wool. Of course it did. They both turned as Lena entered from the hallway, her hair now braided back with a ribbon the color of cranberry. Her shoes were scuffed with charcoal dust from the print studio, and a small sketchpad peeked from the satchel at her side. "I finished the last commission," she said, eyes darting from one to the other. "Captain Gaines said the poster makes the Harrow ships look almost noble." Elias chuckled, warm and quiet. "Almost?" "Well," Lena shrugged, "they're ships, not knights." Rachel knelt and adjusted the hem of Lena's skirt. "They're built to carry people home. That's noble enough." The girl didn't answer. She only looked at Rachel with that open, unguarded gaze that had taken months to surface, and then gently leaned forward to press her cheek against Rachel's shoulder. No words, just the weight of gratitude, silently offered. That afternoon, Mrs. Quinn arrived for her weekly visit. She no longer lived in the Harrow house, but in a cosy cottage nearby, where her days were filled with knitting, pruning rose bushes, and maintaining an eagle-eyed vigilance over her new neighbours. Yet, every Thursday, without fail, she returned to the estate, as constant as the tide. The housekeeper turned matriarch brought with her a tin of shortbread and a new letter from Boston. Over tea, she watched Lena sketch a new draft for the shipping firm's winter ledger cover, and commented with dry approval, "At least this one doesn't have wings on the ship, child." I thought it needed hope, Lena replied, teasing. Mrs. Quinn gave a short sniff, then smiled. Hope can have sails. Outside, the wind had begun to pick up. A brittle edge had entered the air, and clouds crawled low on the horizon, heavy with unshed rain. By nightfall, the storm had arrived. It came not as thunderous spectacle, but as a creeping force, steely winds and relentless rain, battering the coast with the kind of persistence that sent sailors to prayer and engineers to panic. Inside the Harrow estate, Elias stood by the parlour window, his hand gripping the sill. Rachel found him there, his face tense, jaw locked. The new pier, his pier, was out there in the dark, enduring its first test under nature's merciless eye. You don't have to watch, she said softly. He didn't answer. Rachel stepped closer. You built it differently this time. You built it without pride. His voice was barely audible. But it still carries my name. She reached for his hand. It was cold, trembling slightly. I carry your name too, she whispered, and I'm still standing. He turned toward her at last. The storm howled louder. Rachel slipped into her coat and took his. Come, she said, her voice calm but unyielding. Let's see it through. They rode in the open cart, heads bowed beneath hoods, the lantern swinging with every rut in the path. The wind bit at their skin, and rain turned the road to slick ribbons of mud. But Rachel never released his hand, and Elias never asked to turn back. When they reached the docks, the workers were gathered under the depot roof, murmuring about whether to retreat. Elias stepped onto the platform, the rain flattening his hair against his scarred temple. His boots echoed against the damp planks as he walked to the edge and stared down at the angry waters battering the pier. It held, but it groaned. Rachel joined him without a word, her skirts soaked to the hem, her shoes ruined. She placed both hands on the rail and whispered, "Let it know we believe in it." And so they stood side by side as gust after gust beat against the pier. One of the younger dockhands approached and silently took a post near them, then another and another, until the entire crew stood, bracing themselves against the wind, not to fight it, but to hold the line. At last, the storm waned. The pier stood whole. Back home, after a change of clothes and the warmth of brandy by the fire, Rachel unwrapped the final gift she had commissioned weeks before. She called Elias and Lena into the parlour, where a large object rested beneath a linen cloth. "What is it?" Elias asked. "Something honest," Rachel replied. She pulled away the cloth. It was a portrait, oil on canvas, bold and unvarnished. Elias seated at the centre, his scar not hidden but honoured, softened only by the gentle light cast from one side. Beside him, Rachel, standing, one hand on his shoulder, eyes serene and unwavering. And between them, seated cross-legged on a rug, Lena, sketchbook in hand, her face turned slightly up, not toward the viewer, but toward them. There were no embellishments, no aristocratic props or artificial backdrops, just them. A family made not from legacy, but from resilience. Elias stared at the painting for a long time. "She got the colour of your strength wrong," he murmured. Rachel raised a brow. "Oh, it's not ivory," he said. "It's flame." She smiled. "Then let it burn quietly. That's how it lasts." He stepped behind her and rested his chin on her shoulder once more. They stood before the portrait until the fire dimmed low, their reflections flickering in the glass. The Harrow name, once burdened by silence and shame, now meant something else entirely. It meant courage chosen when retreat was easier. It meant love sustained by truth. It meant family, not inherited, but forged. And as dawn broke over Providence the next day, gilding the repaired pier with golden light and chasing the last traces of the storm into memory, the legacy of Elias Harrow stood, weathered, imperfect, and indestructible. The wind that rustled through Providence that October had the scent of ripe apples and chimney smoke, curling like memory through the trees. At the edge of the estate, overlooking the silver-blue bay, the Harrow house stood taller than it once had, not in stature, but in soul. The years had not dulled the land's harsh edges, nor softened the Atlantic's moods, but they had carved new rhythms into the earth. What once was brittle silence had become laughter echoing down the corridors. What once was a house built of shame had become a home stitched together by grace. Rachel sat on the garden bench wrapped in a knitted shawl, her hands resting over the soft curve of her belly. Not swollen, not delicate, merely soft, full, fulfilled. Her second child would be born in winter. The first, a boy named Samuel Elias, was now 3, full of questions and mischief, running barefoot across the grass with a toy boat Lena had carved for him. He had his father's eyes and his mother's stubborn jaw. When he laughed, he sounded like wind chimes in summer. When he cried, he went to Elias first, only to find his way back to Rachel's lap when it mattered most. Marriage had not made Rachel Alder a different woman. It had simply allowed her to become more fully herself. And Elias Harrow, he had changed in the quietest ways. His shoulders still bore the weight of responsibility, but his eyes no longer flinched from mirrors. The scar had faded slightly with time, but he no longer tried to hide it, not even when portraits were painted for the firm's annual ledgers. It had become a symbol, not of tragedy, but of survival. Lawrence Harrow had vanished from society in disgrace. Stripped of inheritance, influence, and allies, he attempted to restore his reputation in Chicago, where his name carried less scandal. But greed has a way of festering. He invested what little remained in reckless ventures. By the second year, word arrived that he had been jailed for embezzlement. No one in the Harrow house spoke his name anymore, not out of hatred, but from a quiet conviction that some ghosts are best buried with dignity. Mrs. Quinn still came every Thursday. Her cane was now more necessity than habit, and she had given up knitting in favor of storytelling. Samuel was her favorite audience. She told him tales of ships that carried cinnamon from India, and of a brave girl who once lived in a house with too many locked doors. Her voice grew softer each season, but when she laughed, it was with the force of a woman who had seen 2 lifetimes and survived both. Lena, now 19, had been accepted into the Rhode Island School of Design. She traveled to Boston twice a month, exhibiting her work in small galleries where she often refused to sign her full name. "Lena Harrow," she would say quietly, "is not the one painting anymore. That girl used to hide." She had found her strength in ink and sketch and silence. Rachel still kept her very first drawing, of Elias, unguarded, inside a drawer in her writing desk. Society too had shifted, slowly, reluctantly, but it changed. The Harrow Pier design was now used in 6 coastal cities, credited jointly to Elias and Rachel. Some men scoffed at a woman's name, etched into engineering reports, until their docks weathered storms more stubborn than any they had seen before. Other women took notice. Letters arrived at the estate, from teachers, from widows, from women in modest homes who had once read about Rachel Alder in the Providence Herald and whispered her name like a rebellion tucked behind lace fans. She answered every letter herself. On this particular morning, Elias joined her on the bench, his hair grayer now at the temples. His hands, once calloused from blueprints and ropes, were gentler when they curled over hers. He brought with him 2 mugs of coffee and a small paper boat that Samuel had begged him to fix. He handed her the mug and looked out at the sea. "It'll be storm season soon." Rachel smiled. "We've weathered worse." He turned his head, studying her face the way he had when they first met, not with admiration, but with reverence. "Do you ever miss the quiet?" he asked. "No," she said, tilting her head toward the garden where Samuel shrieked with glee. "I was never meant for silence." They sat there, watching the child who bore their love in every unruly curl and delighted cry, watching the girl who had once been a shadow now prepare to cross the world with her art, watching the home that had once been a tomb now breathe with life. Inside, above the fireplace, still hung the portrait. Elias with his scar, Rachel with her calm defiance, Lena with her open sketchbook. But beside it now hung another, a newer canvas painted by Lena herself. It showed Rachel cradling an infant wrapped in a navy shawl. Elias knelt beside her, hands not on the child, but on her face, forehead pressed to hers. In the background, Samuel peeked from behind a chair, eyes wide with wonder. The house was barely sketched. The landscape faded at the edges. What endured was the embrace, not legacy, not wealth, but love that had been tested by storm and flame and endured. And in that fading light of afternoon, as the sea whispered to the rocks below, Rachel knew this truth more deeply than she had ever known anything. The world would change again. The winds would shift. But some homes, like some hearts, were built not to be admired but to last, and theirs had lasted. At the heart of this story lies a simple, timeless truth. Love, when built on honesty, courage, and quiet resilience, can withstand even the fiercest storms. Rachel's journey was never about perfection. It was about presence, about choosing to stay when it would have been easier to walk away, about seeing beyond scars, past society's cruelty, and into the soul of a man who had forgotten how to believe in himself. It was about creating a family not from blood or expectation, but from choice, tenderness, and unshakable loyalty. We hope this story touched your heart and reminded you that the strongest legacies are not written in marble or money, but in acts of grace, in voices raised for truth, and in hands held through the darkness. If this tale moved you, please let us know by leaving a comment below. And if you made it all the way to the end, write the word legacy in your comment. It's our way of knowing who stayed until the last echo of this love story. If you'd like to support the team that brings these emotional, historical romances to life, we would be incredibly grateful for a super thanks in any amount you feel moved to give. Your generosity helps us continue telling stories that matter. And if that's not possible for you right now, simply sharing this video with someone who loves heartfelt tales is a beautiful way to help us grow this little corner of the world. You can also explore more unforgettable love stories like this one. Just click on the recommendations we've left for you in the video cards. Thank you, truly, for being part of this journey. Your presence here means more than words can say.